Welcome to tonight's virtual Civil War presentation brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com. Thanks for joining us. Tonight's guest is Scott L. Mingus, Sr., discussing his book, Targeted Tracks, the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, published by Savas Beatty last year. The series is provided by CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War discussion forum. We're pleased to be able to provide these programs, Civil War authors and programs, to you via the live virtual platform. If you aren't already a member of Civil War Talk, we'll be providing membership information later in the program. Membership's always free, and we encourage everyone to join the Civil War Talk community.
Our guest tonight is Scott L. Mingus, Sr., the Ohio native, graduated from the Paper Science and Engineering program at Miami University. He is a scientist and consultant in the global pulp and paper industry and holds patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels. Mingus is the author of 19 Civil War and Underground Railroad books, including a biography of Confederate General William Extra Billy Smith, which won multiple awards, including the Dr. James I. Robertson Jr. Literary Award for Confederate History. He has also written articles for many publications, including Gettysburg Magazine. Tonight, Mr. Mingus will be discussing his book, Targeted Tracks, the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, published by Savas Beatty in 2019. The Civil War was the first conflict in which railroads played a major role. Although much has been written about their role in general, little has been written about specific lines. The Cumberland Valley Railroad, for example, played an important strategic role by connecting Hagerstown, Maryland to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Its location enhanced its importance during some of the Civil War's most critical campaigns. Despite the line's significance to the Union war effort, its remarkable story remains little known. The publication of Targeted Tracks, the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by Scott L. Mingus Sr. and Cooper H. Wingart, rectifies that oversight. Please join me in welcoming Scott Mingus.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Can everybody see my screen?
Not
Yes.
yet.
Yes?
No, not yet.
Okay. Let's figure out what's going on.
Oh, he isn't a co-host, Laura. Does that make a difference?
No, I enabled screen sharing for him. Try the green button at the bottom, Scott.
Yeah, I'm trying to get back to there. Okay. Screen sharing selected. All right. You can see me. I'm trying to get you guys to see my slides. How are the slides coming through now?
No.
Oh, we had them earlier. Window selected is invalid. Okay. Let's try it again. How about now?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks. Sorry about that. Again, my name is Scott Mingus. I'm an author originally from Southern Ohio, now living here in York, Pennsylvania. Over the years, since moving here in 2001, I became fascinated with the idea of the railroads that ran between Pennsylvania and Maryland during the Civil War. My grandfather was a bridge builder for one of the railroads in Northern Ohio. So I grew up in a railroad family. In fact, I grew up right seeing the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks right from my front porch of my parents' house. So I've always been a railroad nut. Do a lot of model railroading as well. But what I want to do today is talk about the Cumberland Valley Railroad. As mentioned, there were three railroads that ran from Maryland to Pennsylvania during the Civil War. From east to west, they were the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad that ran, of course, through those three cities. To the west of that, in the middle of the three railroads, was the Northern Central Railway, which ran from Baltimore due north through York, Pennsylvania to Harrisburg and on up to Elmira, New York as the war closed. And the third railroad, the one that was the smallest of the bunch, but in many ways was every bit as strategically important as the other two, was the Cumberland Valley Railroad. So we're going to take the first 10 minutes or so and give you a quick background on the railroad and why it was actually a pretty important little railroad. And then we're going to launch into the Civil War. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Cumberland Valley, you can think of it as the northern extension of the Shenandoah Valley. So if you look on the screen, the map of the Great Appalachian Valley, this goes all the way from Alabama way up into Canada. And there's a whole series of different small ridges and small valleys, some of which are larger than the others. 14 valleys, in fact, in total. The Shenandoah Valley is number 8 on the list. They're shown where it says North Mountain and Blue Ridge. And just north of that in the yellow is the Cumberland Valley. So the Cumberland Valley is, in effect, the Shenandoah Valley in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So the Cumberland Valley in Pennsylvania history was started out as a French fur trapping area, very, very rich in beavers and otter and a number of other natural resources. And over time, in just 30 years after the first French trapper arrived in the Cumberland Valley, there's enough people to carve out a county. And within another generation beyond that, by 1784, there are actually 2 counties, Cumberland County and Franklin County. These are the 2 counties that the railroad will run through during the Civil War. Franklin County is probably best known as Chambersburg at the county seat, and the Cumberland Valley, of course, is Carlisle. So those are the 2 largest cities in the Cumberland Valley we're going to be talking about. Now, one of the key things was the southern end of the Cumberland Valley, the National Road, today's US Route 40, ran east-west from Baltimore out into the interior of the country. There was a long desire in both Maryland and Pennsylvania to connect that valley and connect that road to Harrisburg. And so over the years, there were a number of attempts made to start putting a railroad in the region, and none of them were very successful. The canal company wanted to do it. A number of private investors from both Maryland and Pennsylvania wanted to give it a shot. Finally, a Carlisle businessman by the name of Frederick Watts and a number of investors from Philadelphia stepped in and they decided to build the first leg of the railroad from Harrisburg to Chambersburg. So in April of 1835, Governor Wolfe, no, not the Governor Wolfe we have today, that's been on the news so much in the last couple of days, but this is Governor George Wolfe way back in 1835. He gives the railroad 6 years to come up with enough money. Well, the railroad instantly starts raising stock. And in fact, they raised $642,000 in 1835 money in just a matter of weeks. Massive amount of money. As we're going to find out, that's not enough. Not even close. They get a charter. They end up hiring their first president, a guy named Thomas McCullough, very well known in Pennsylvania circles of the time as a War of 1812 military officer. But the railroad's off to a pretty good start. Fred Watts, the guy who is in effect, you can call him the founder of the railroad, is a member of the board of directors. That board is rather unique, as is the railroad, because the financial officers, the treasurer, CFO, et cetera, are based in Philadelphia. Fred Watt is based in Carlisle. Some of the other officers are based in Harrisburg, and the railroad's chief operations officer and most of the other officials are in Chambersburg. So it's one of the few railroads that the brass, if you will, is totally scattered throughout the southern part of Pennsylvania. That is going to both be a hindrance to smooth operations of the railroad. It's also going to be a godsend when the Civil War starts, as we'll find out. They hired probably one of the 4 or 5 best railroad engineers of the day, a guy named William Miller Roberts, and he sets out to build the railroad from Chambersburg to Harrisburg. Now, one of the most interesting things about the construction of the railroad, and it just starts to show the attitude of the railroad, is the ability to raise capital. Originally, they wanted to run the railroad from Carlisle to Shippensburg. You can see a very faint blue line on the map. That's the route the railroad was supposed to go. Well, the citizens of Newville actually want this railroad to run through their little village because they think they can become a good-sized town. And they actually will raise $2,500 in cash, and in effect, they bribe the railroad to reroute through their little town. Now, if anybody's ever been to Newville, Pennsylvania, it didn't work. The town's still a tiny little crossroads village to this day. But way back then, the ambitious businessmen and farmers of that region thought by investing $2,500 with the railroad, they would become just as important, if not more important, than Carlisle or Chambersburg. So the railroad's going to hire a general contractor, and they start running into money problems almost immediately. Part of the problems is that the railroad engineer, Milner Roberts, and the contractor, Joe Snowden, both have the visionary idea, that at some point we're going to need a double track for the Cumberland Valley. So right now, in this era, in 1830s, most railroads only had a single track, and so you're worried about head-on collisions, unless you had sidings and a really good schedule, so that trains going one direction and whack into the trains going the other direction. Well, these guys decided, let's go ahead and try at least make this railroad wide enough to put a second set of tracks in. But that doubled their costs, and they were able to lay down the first set of track, but they're now almost out of money. All that $645,000 or so is now long gone. They end up ordering 3 locomotives, though, from a company in Philadelphia, William Norris, who was the leading railroad producer of locomotives, steam engines, and equipment in the 1830s in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They bought them in effect on credit, told them they couldn't raise any more than $6,800 for each locomotive. By then, it's 1837. As we all know, the Panic of 1837 takes hold. This railroad does the unique thing of raising what's called chin plasters, for want of a better term, which in effect were worthless stock promissory notes, because they're $200,000 in the hole already. All that investment seed money's long gone. They promise a new wave of investors will give you 6% interest in 1 year. And Watson, this board is so persuasive, they pull it off, and they raise another $200,000 to keep the railroad going. And with that, they finish the infrastructure. They end up building the engine shops, they build the turntables, they put a fuel and water stop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, Chambersburg, which is the de facto corporate headquarters. They put a depot, machine shops, engine house, repair facilities, depot, train rest station, one of the first rest areas for women with a separate room for women in a train station. But they also did something rather unique. Again, this railroad's very interesting from the standpoint. We've all heard the term the wrong side of the tracks. You guys have heard that? There were no wrong side of the tracks with the Cumberland Valley Railroad because they ran their tracks through the middle of every downtown. So there, if you look on the picture, this is Carlisle, Pennsylvania. On the left, you'll see churches and nice buildings. On the right, nice buildings. There is no wrong side of the tracks. They're going right to the smack of downtown. And the railroad in 1837 gets their first locomotive. They're going to make one and only one test run. They're going to run from Camp Hill on the west shore of the Susquehanna River, west of Harrisburg. They're going to run down to Carlisle. It takes them a little less than an hour to do it. Based on one trial on August 19th, the railroad says we're ready to go. So on November 16th, they pull more passengers than any railroad in Pennsylvania history when they put 500 people loaded onto a train that's only run one time before, including future well-known Civil War Congressman Thaddeus Stevens is one of the guys that's on board this initial trip, and they pull it off. They take 7 cars with 500 people. Again, the most people ever loaded on a train in Pennsylvania history at that point in time. They have a giant party for them in Chambersburg, take them back to Harrisburg. Now, what they've accomplished is critical to the railroad's success. What they've accomplished is national publicity. And so over the next 3 or 4 weeks, most major newspapers in the entire United States start talking about the Cumberland Valley Railroad, this little regional railroad in south central Pennsylvania that dares to run 500 people on a train. And they taught a lot of the other innovations the railroad is trying to bring into play. Well, they start in January 1838 with their first railroad excursions commercially. And their very first advertising campaign, it's kind of amazing. If you guys might be Amazon Prime members out there, well, these guys were out Amazoning Amazon 150 years before Amazon was even thought of. These guys were, you could butcher a cow in the morning in the Cumberland Valley, put it on a railroad car, and have it for dinner at the finest restaurants in Philadelphia that night. Same day delivery. And they didn't charge you like Prime does for a membership. All you had to do was buy the train ticket for whatever the cargo was. And this innovation, getting fresh beef into the market in Philadelphia, gave the Philadelphia hotels and restaurants that were involved in this venture a massive head up because of the wonderful grazing and the unique taste of the beef from the Cumberland Valley. So the railroad's making all kinds of innovations. The next big innovation is the Cumberland Valley becomes the first railroad in American history to run a dedicated sleeper car. They would have stagecoaches coming up and over the mountains from Pittsburgh, roll into Chambersburg at midnight, put the people on the train, leave for Harrisburg at 1 o'clock in the morning. And the men, not the ladies, the men got to sleep on these booths. Poor ladies had to sit on the wooden benches that were in the ladies' car, but the men could at least lay down on these booths. Now, having taken Amtrak many times from Lorton, Virginia down to Sanford, Florida with my grandkids to see Mickey Mouse, I can tell you that today's Amtrak cars are probably not much more comfortable than this thing was. But it was unique because a lot of the descriptions of this car talk about the unique noises that came from this car between people snoring and making other kinds of noises from their body, spitting all night long. The floors in the mornings would be a real mess with folks who were spitting. Well, the Cumberland Valley, again, key point, they're making national news. Again, people are starting to look at this little tiny railroad. Here's the next big innovation, trying to get across the Susquehanna River into downtown Harrisburg. They build this 4,000-foot covered bridge. Now, unlike most bridges, they don't go inside the bridge. They put the train on the roof. And they're going to use the inside of the bridge for passengers. And they're going to compete with the toll bridge that you see on the left, the Camelback Bridge. And so the Cumberland Valley is in direct competition with that bridge. Now, the passengers up on top of the train aren't real happy. The locomotives are really heavy. The bridge is underbuilt for the size of the locomotives of that era, and the train tends to cause the bridge to sway rather heavily. And in fact, there are letters and diaries of people who are quite worried that this thing's going to fall into the drink, that the train's just going to simply go off the edge because you notice there's no guardrails. So people, sitting in these swaying cars are quite worried to the point where the railroad finally has to say, we're not going to put any more locomotives here. We are going to simply start running mules on this bridge, and we're going to pull the train cars across using mules so we don't scare the passengers anymore. Well, in 1841, Judge Watts assumes the full control of the railroad. Now, Fred Watts, I mentioned earlier a couple times. I did not mention to you, though, he's the father of Penn State. So for those folks who are familiar with the Pennsylvania State University, Frederick Watts is actually the key individual that led the charge to create a state teachers high school that later became Pennsylvania State University. Watts is the guiding hand that directs the railroad. They end up acquiring a sister railroad that ran from Chambersburg south to Hagerstown called the Franklin Railroad, and they will unite that into one railroad, the Cumberland Valley. Here's a quick shot of Greencastle, Pennsylvania. Just again, show you typically that they're going through the middle of town. Again, this is going to play a huge role once we get to the Civil War as to how this railroad is going to be meted out. You see at the bottom of the screen, there's a small spur runs off to the factory. That's the factory that's in the picture that I show on the screen as well. So here's the final tally. The Cumberland Valley Railroad runs again from Harrisburg, the upper right of the screen, on that bridge, across the river over to the west shore, and then it runs through what's now Camp Hill, Mechanicsburg, Carlisle, Newville, where they paid the $2,500 bucks, Shippensburg, Scotland. Now, Scotland is the first significant piece of terrain. They got to cross over a pretty hefty sized creek. And so the bridge at Scotland becomes the single most important structure in the railroad west of the Susquehanna River. From Scotland, once you cross that bridge, that you see Chambersburg, two smaller towns in the lower Cumberland Valley, Marion and Greencastle, Pennsylvania, and finally rolling into Hagerstown, where it met, again, the National Road or US Route 40. Well, the railroad still got financial issues. The bridge burns down in 1844. They rebuild the thing just in time for a flood to take the new bridge down. And so they got to spend even more money and build the bridge again. So this railroad has got a long history by now of worrying about fires destroying structures. They worry about keeping their right-of-way going, and they realize how vulnerable they really are because of that bridge structure. Now they're going to start buying some of the most advanced locomotives in America in the 1850s. The one on the left is the oldest remaining railroad locomotive in Pennsylvania. It's actually owned by Smithsonian. It's currently on display in Maryland at the Baltimore and Ohio Museum. This is the Jenny Lind, the Pioneer, sister of the Jenny Lind. They're going to build a very small little locomotive to put on the bridge to replace the mules. That's the utility. Again, I bring this up as background because it's going to figure into our story pretty prominently here in about 5 minutes or so. And the final innovation I want to talk about is the combination car. The railroad was getting hit with a lot of claims for people who were losing their baggage. So they end up building a combination car where you simply brought your bags on with you, left your bags in the front part of the car, and went in the back part of the car where you see the windows and sat down. You were responsible for getting your own baggage as you left the train. And if the train pulled away with your bags, well, too bad, because you had the chance to get those yourself. That's all the good in the national press. And the Cumberland Valley is just churning along, doing a pretty good job. And then things start changing. For one, they start having partnerships with other railroads, particularly the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsy will start almost acting like they're trying to take control of the Cumberland Valley. They don't until after the war. But the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Northern Central Cumberland Valley, and the Lebanon Valley Railroad share this magnificent train station in downtown Harrisburg, which was unique in that day because in many cities such as Baltimore or Philadelphia, individual railroads had their own train stations on the outskirts of town, and you had to ride through downtown to actually connect to these different railroads. Here's where the publicity starts turning negative. The Cumberland Valley Railroad starts getting a reputation as wink, wink when it came to fugitive slaves, freedom seekers on their way to the north. Here's a typical newspaper ad from the Southern newspaper in Maryland. Hagerstown Herald reports that the 5 slaves who escaped from that county on Saturday not been recaptured. The horses and vehicles were recovered at Chambersburg, but the slaves took the cars for Harrisburg. There are very few accounts of slaves being recaptured once they get to the Cumberland Valley Railroad. And they become pretty widely known among the fugitive slave population, folks who are seeking to cross the Mason-Dixon line. They follow railroad tracks. Sooner or later, you'll find somebody along that railroad who's going to be friendly to you. And then Dr. Isaac Smith shows up in downtown Chambersburg on the Cumberland Valley Railroad. He's bringing black men with him. He brings white men with him, family members. Smith calls himself a miner. He says he's looking to try to find iron ore mines, which are pretty common in the Cumberland Valley during that period of time. He starts shipping in tools, long boxes of tools on the Cumberland Valley to the warehouse. And he starts bringing in these conspirators, and they're all staying at the widow of the governor, actually the son of the former governor of Pennsylvania. Well, Brown himself will meet with Frederick Douglass outside of Chambersburg. Douglass takes the CVRR, brings one guy with him, and Brown tries to talk Frederick Douglass into joining his scheme to attack Harper's Ferry. Frederick Douglass, to his credit, does not join the scheme, but his guy that's with him does, and ends up dying with John Brown. Now, after the raid in October 1859, the men who survived the raid head for the Cumberland Valley Railroad, trying to make it back to Chambersburg or to Scotland to get on the railroad. Most of them were recaptured. One black man who was a member of John Brown's party, a guy named Osborne Perry Anderson, actually does get on the Cumberland Valley Railroad at Scotland and takes it all the way here to York, Pennsylvania, where the Underground Railroad operatives here in York County take him, and eventually Osborne Perry Anderson will make it to Canada. He will be the only black survivor of John Brown's raid and will certainly live in Canada for a number of years until he comes home. But again, the publicity is now really bad because at the trial and the other national newspapers that are covering the John Brown story, a lot of people were worried, particularly in the South, that the Cumberland Valley Railroad was actually involved in the whole plot. And the railroad's got to produce documents that, the pikes, the weapons, the swords that were shipped on their railroad were actually, on the bills of lading were listed as being mining tools. So the railroad's starting to get this uncomfortable reputation just as the war begins. And as we all know, in April of 1861, the war begins with the firing at Fort Sumter. The Cumberland Valley Railroad, like most railroads of the day, relays the message up and down its line via the telegraph. And very quickly, people start realizing that we're at war. Now, the Cumberland Valley Railroad plays a very interesting role right away. There are a number of Southern officers that are still at the Carlisle Barracks. That's a cavalry barracks in Carlisle, a number of Southern officers who have not yet resigned, now due to resign, and they take the train south into Hagerstown. Well, as they're going through Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, the train filled with Confederates, if you will, former United States officers. As they look out of the train cars, they see a dummy in a Confederate uniform hanging from the telegraph wires with a sign on it that says, thus doomed to all traitors. And so the Cumberland Valley sent its own little message to the Southerners right away, basically saying, you guys are traitors. Well, they're not ready for the war by any stretch of imagination. They've got 12 locomotives, they've got 8 passenger cars, 4 baggage express cars, 79 freight cars. They're not ready by any stretch. Now, this is a small little regional railroad, so they think they're okay. The problem is the Shenandoah/Cumberland Valley is going to almost immediately become one of the theaters of the war. Cumberland Valley Railroad starts transporting troops up to Harrisburg, and within days, they got to turn around and bring them back down. Because Thomas Jonathan Jackson has seized Harper's Ferry, and his commander, Joseph Johnston, has taken command of all the Confederate forces in the lower Cumberland Valley and in the Shenandoah Valley. The United States starts bringing troops into the Cumberland Valley, and they got to do it on the Cumberland Valley Railroad. The CVR becomes the first railroad to start moving an army, Union Army, at least into position for battle. General Robert Patterson, a War of 1812 veteran, shows up in Chambersburg. He arrives on a Sunday night. Rather interesting. Shows up on a CVR train bedecked with all kinds of patriotic trappings, if you will. He has a parade through the town with a martial band playing all kinds of stirring marches. He has rented out the local girls' dormitory for a party that night, and they throw a ball for his officers. He immediately gets in trouble with Chambersburg's authorities because this all happens on a Sunday, and he's violated a bunch of ordinances, including no parades on Sunday, no military gatherings, no balls on Sunday, no non-church music on Sunday. And Patterson just simply has gotten into all kinds of hot water with the locals. They're only too happy when Patterson and his army finally leave, and they head down to the Shenandoah Valley. Now, this map will show the significance of the Cumberland Valley Railroad to the very first major campaign of the war. Patterson's job is to hold Joe Johnston and Thomas Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. Don't let them escape. Now, you'll see railroad number 6 towards the lower center of the picture, just north of Warrenton, Virginia. That's the Manassas Gap Railroad. And you see way up to the top, number 2, that is the Cumberland Valley Railroad. Well, the Yankees have arrived in the Cumberland Valley. They've marched through Hagerstown down towards Charlestown, but Patterson utterly fails to hold Johnston in the valley. And we all know Johnston is able to get his army away from Robert Patterson, They make it to Front Royal in Strasbourg, and they are going to arrive via rail in time for the second day of the Battle of Manassas. And of course, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Joe Johnston, Stonewall Jackson, defeat Irvin McDowell, and now Lincoln and the War Department know this war is now going to last a lot longer than we thought. Now, Patterson himself is in effect ditched as a commander. He's going to go back through Chambersburg on an unmarked train this time so that nobody knows who the guy is. He's going to slink all the way back to Philadelphia, but don't feel bad for Bob Patterson. He owns a number of textile mills in the Philadelphia area. He can't get Southern cotton, but being the wheeler dealer that he is, he forms a deal with the Khedive of Egypt and starts bringing in what we know today as Egyptian cotton. So those of us who sleep on Egyptian cotton sheets at night, we can thank Bob Patterson for bringing in the first significant quantities of Egyptian cotton to circumvent the Southern cotton supply that's been cut off. Let's fast forward almost a year. The Cumberland Valley makes news again. The guy on the right of the picture is going to be very familiar to our watchers and listeners tonight. That's John Fulton Reynolds. Reynolds, of course, will later become the most senior ranking Union general to die at Gettysburg. But at this point in time, John Reynolds is not a happy camper. He's been taken out of the Army of Potomac. He's a brigadier general at this point in time, and he's been given command of the Pennsylvania State Militia. And he doesn't think a whole lot about the militia. But everybody's concerned in Pennsylvania that the rebels are coming into the Commonwealth. The governor, Andrew Gregg Curtin, has issued a call for the state emergency militia to assemble. Reynolds has command of them, and they're going to start sending tens of thousands of Pennsylvania troops with between 1 and 3 days of training on the Cumberland Valley Railroad back down to Chambersburg again. By now, they've had to borrow railroad cars from the Pennsylvania Railroad, from the Northern Central, from just about any other railroad they can get their hands on. And you got soldiers that are going in cattle cars and gondolas and coal cars and anything and everything that has wheels, they're moving down there. Reynolds himself just isn't really happy. He actually writes a letter to his sister denigrating his own troops, talking about how bad they are, tells his sister that, there's nothing in the Cumberland Valley to stop the rebels because my men sure aren't going to do it. And our Army of Potomac's too far apart. But he tells his sister, don't really worry in Lancaster. And I love his final note to her. Burn this up and do not let anyone see it. Obviously, his sister never burned the letter. So my co-author Cooper Wingert found this in Franklin and Marshall University, Franklin and Marshall College, I guess, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And John Fulton Reynolds will go down in history, at least to us, as a brigadier general that didn't like his troops. Now, as a major general a year later, hopefully he liked the First Corps a little bit better than he liked his Pennsylvania State Militiamen. But he didn't want anyone to ever read this letter, let alone somebody on a weird technology he never would have dreamed of, broadcasting to the whole world that John Reynolds wrote a letter about his own troops. Well, the Cumberland Valley comes back into the press just a couple of days later that at the peak of the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, George McClellan is starting to run low on long distance 20 and 24 pound Parrott shell ammunition. Sends a telegraph back to Washington, says, I need new ammunition. They're going to load it up in Washington and the Baltimore and Ohio, take it up the north to Baltimore, transfer it through the inner harbor using mules to draw the railroad cars to the Northern Central, where the Northern Central brings the ammunition cars up to the CVRR. The Cumberland Valley Railroad has its most powerful engine, relatively new engine, and they are going to set a new speed record as they're going from Baltimore up to Harrisburg, back down to Hagerstown, only 4 hours and 31 minutes. That's 37 miles an hour, which is the fastest a fully loaded passenger freight train had ever run that I can find in Pennsylvania history over that sustained distance. In fact, they're running the train so recklessly and so quickly that the journal boxes, which were oil-soaked rags used to lubricate and reduce the friction of the bearings, catch on fire. Now you can imagine the good citizens of Carlisle and Chambersburg realizing you got a wooden train car on fire when it rolls into your town filled with 24-pound parrot shells for the Army of the Potomac. Might be a little disconcerting because, again, the railroad tracks run right through the middle of downtown. And they're stopping right in the middle of downtown to try to cool these train cars off. They're successful. Luckily, they put all the fires out. The train never blows up, and they complete the run, getting the ammunition down to Hagerstown. It's put into wagons, taken to McClellan at Keedysville, only to have McClellan say, "I never needed it to begin with. I'm not going to renew the attack." It never happens. But the railroad makes, again, all kinds of wonderful publicity because of this amazing, what I call the amazing ammunition, Antietam ammunition run. But the press goes negative just a week later. You can see this is the route from Washington to Baltimore on up for this ammunition run. Pay attention to Harrisburg, though. This train with the ammunition never had to cross the river into Harrisburg. But after the Battle of Antietam, all that militia that's sitting down around Sharpsburg, Keysville, Harpers Ferry, Williamsport area, all these guys have got to get home. And Brigadier General John Fulton Reynolds loads them back up into CVR train cars that are now empty with all the ammunition gone, and they start running them back to Harrisburg, and tragedy hits. On the early morning of September 26th, in a massive fog bank, that little bridge tender, the little utility locomotive that was bought specifically to put on top of that covered bridge, in the fog bank, the troop train at full blast smashes into the utility, kills, there were maims, 30 soldiers, wipes out almost a half a company from Reading, Pennsylvania, the 20th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia. Well, Judge Watts, knowing he's going to lose his contract with the U.S. Army to move troops if there's a lawsuit, goes to Reading and Philadelphia and personally pays off every single family that was involved of the loved ones of this tragedy so that nobody ever sues them and his railroad can keep their lucrative contract. But all this has caught the attention of somebody else, Robert E. Lee. Lee is now convinced the Cumberland Valley Railroad needs to be dealt with. So in October of 1862, less than a month after the Battle of Antietam, he's going to send Jeb Stuart on what Stuart at that point in time did best. That's right around the Yankee Army. You can see McClellan's army there in central Maryland. Stuart's going to start out in what's now West Virginia. He's going to ride to Chambersburg. His job is to collect information on McClellan's army. It's to destroy the Cumberland Valley Railroad, to seize any Yankees that might be of value, like postmasters or federal judges, anything along those lines. Most importantly, Jeb Stuart is to burn the bridge at Scotland. That's a critical part of his mission. Well, Stuart's men come rolling into Chambersburg. This is Harper's Weekly showing what Chambersburg, Pennsylvania would have looked like in October of 1862 in the first shot. Bottom left shows Jeb Stuart's troopers going through the warehouses. By the way, that's the very same warehouse that John Brown had used to stage his raid on Harper's Ferry. Confederates, of course, don't know that, but they are going to raid all the U.S. Army equipment that's there. And Stuart will then burn the railroad facilities. Doesn't burn anything else, just burns the railroad facilities. Takes down all the turntable, the engine houses, repair facilities, everything else that he's built, the railroad does, it's all gone at that point in time. But he never goes after the Scotland Bridge. As he's in Chambersburg, some citizen or citizens lie through their teeth and they tell Jeb Stuart, you know, you can't burn the Scotland Bridge, it's made of iron. And Stuart believes them, and Jeb Stuart does not go for that bridge, even though that is one of the things he's supposed to do. After he raids the railroad, he heads out. He goes to within 6 miles of Gettysburg on his ride around McClellan's army and turns south on the Fairfield Road, eventually going back to Leesburg, Virginia, crossing the Potomac River and heading home. Well, the railroad's now got a decision to make. You've lost everything at Chambersburg. Do we rebuild? Judge Watts and the board of directors meet in Philadelphia, and they decide, let's rebuild. The rebels have come into the Cumberland Valley in 1862. They're not coming back. That was their one and only shot of getting into Pennsylvania. Fast forward to late June 1863. Are the rebels coming back to Pennsylvania? Of course they are. Now it's the Gettysburg campaign. Albert Gallatin Jenkins starts bringing his mounted infantry and into Pennsylvania. His first immediate goal is to wreck the railroad. And so he starts destroying ties, takes out the culverts, switches, anything he can find, rips down all the telegraph lines, and in fact, totally destroys the old Franklin Railroad portion from Hagerstown to Chambersburg, totally gone. In downtown Greencastle, he burns down the depot, almost burns the town down because the depot fire starts spreading. And again, because the railroad's running right through downtown on the main street, it takes quite an effort by the good citizens of Greencastle to actually put the fire out and save everything. Well, he figures out pretty quickly that's not an iron bridge at Scotland. It's a wooden bridge. It doesn't fall for the lies of the Pennsylvanians, and Jenkins burns the second most important structure on the Cumberland Valley Railroad. That was, again, the big bridge over the Conchita Creek. So the 14th Virginia Cavalry takes it down. They continue following the north. They're going to go all the way up through Carlisle with Robert Rhodes' division behind them, and they're going to destroy the bridges and the railroads. Finally, on June 28th, Jenkins is going to capture the train station in Mechanicsburg. He's actually going to go in the hotel that's shown on the right of the screen. Jenkins will get the Yankee newspapers from Harrisburg, order a pitcher of water, put his feet up on the table, and read all about the Union defenses of Harrisburg as he gets ready for Richard Ewell to follow Lee's orders to, quote unquote, capture Harrisburg if it comes within your means. Well, the problem is the means. 22nd New York National Guard sitting there guarding the river crossing. That's the bridge of the Cumberland Valley, of course, in this picture. And the New York State Militia, again, more than 10,000 New York State militiamen are in and around the Harrisburg area. And Albert Gallatin Jenkins decides we're not going for Harrisburg. Ewell's going to make that same call in just a day or two. This Courier Knives print shows the Cumberland Valley Railroad train, and that's the camp of the New York State Militia in what is now Lemoyne area. So one question you might want to be able to impress your friends with is you can ask them, as the Battle of Gettysburg was going on July 1st, what in the world was George Pickett doing? Well, George Pickett's job is to wreck Chambersburg. So on July 1st, Pickett's men, the same guys are going to be charging across those fields in just 2 days at Gettysburg. They are taking delight in wrecking the Cumberland Valley Railroad. So they're going to repeat what Jeb Stuart had just did the previous October, and every single one of those railroad buildings Pickett's men are going to take down. They're going to burn them all. So the turntable warehouses, all the offices, everything disappears. U.S. Army sends Herman Haupt out into Pennsylvania. He's going to rebuild 32 bridges here in York County. He's going to move across the mountains into the Cumberland Valley, and he's going to rebuild the CVRR as well. And so it's amazing, within 3 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Northern Central, the Hanover Branch Railroad, the Gettysburg Railroad, and the Cumberland Valley, all 4 railroads the Confederates had wrecked, are all 4 fully functional within 3 weeks. So one more time, Watts has got to worry about, do we rebuild? The rebels have come in 1862 in the Cumberland Valley. The rebels have come in 1863 in the Cumberland Valley. They rebuilt once, do they rebuild again? No, they do not. This time, the board of directors say, you know, Pennsylvania is not that safe. There's always a chance the Confederates might try it one more time. So let's not rebuild. Let's just make sure the train tracks are okay. Let's rebuild the bridge so we can at least get trains from Hagerstown back up to Harrisburg. We're not going to rebuild the engine house. We're not going to rebuild the repair shops, the train depot, the restaurants, you know, anything else associated with the railroad. We're not rebuilding any of that. The warehouses, we're fine. Good call, because for all of us, I think, are probably aware that the Cumberland Valley Railroad, the reason I call it targeted tracks, for 3 straight years is going to be a target of the Confederate Army. So what happens in the summer of 1864? One more time, the Confederates come into the Cumberland Valley. This time it's Tiger John McCausland. Brigadier General McCausland, commanding Jubal Early's cavalry, brings 2,800 mounted infantrymen and cavalrymen into the Cumberland Valley. They ride smack dab into Chambersburg, take the Cumberland Valley Railroad's vice president as a hostage, as well as other leading citizens, and they ransom Chambersburg for $100,000 in gold or $500,000 in cash. Now, the good citizens of Chambersburg have got a decision to make. Number one, they learned that McCausland's commander is Jubal Early. Well, everybody's familiar with Jubal Early in South Central Pennsylvania. He's the guy that here in York, Pennsylvania had ransomed our city for $100,000. Our chief Burgess had went 10 miles out of town to meet with John Gordon, Early's subordinate. But Early never burns any towns. He only burns military targets. He burns railroad tracks. He burns turntables. He burns rolling stock. Early's never burned a civilian property. Not in York, not in Gettysburg on June 26, 1863. Jubal Early does not burn civilian property. And so the people of Chambersburg are like, he's bluffing, not going to do it. And oh, by the way, they never tell the Confederates this, but William Averill's got Yankee cavalry only 10 miles to the south of them, and they send a courier desperately riding out to look for Averill to tell him the rebels are coming. Now, whether Averill's drunk, tired, sick, or just doesn't care, the courier can't wake the guy up, and Averill will never send his cavalry into Chambersburg. Citizens keep looking anxiously to the south for signs the Yankee cavalry is on their way. They don't come. And to their horror, torches appear. And John McCausland does the unthinkable, at least as far as what Chambersburg's city fathers thought. He starts burning the town. By the time McCausland's done, half of Chambersburg's gone. This shows the Confederate artillery on the Valley Turnpike looking down into the town as it burns. Most of downtown is destroyed, parts of the outskirts, but the railroad suffers almost no damage. Why? Because the Cumberland Valley never rebuilt. They had nothing to lose. And McCausland, in perhaps one of his big mistakes in this campaign, never goes up to Scotland. He's content with burning the town of Chambersburg. He doesn't burn the railroad or do anything to destroy it whatsoever. And he's going to burn down the houses of most of the railroad workers. Doesn't know the railroad workers, but their houses are around there. But almost instantaneously, the telegraph lines that are still up bang out messages, and the Union commanders of the Department of Susquehanna start sending troops on the Cumberland Valley Railroad back down into Chambersburg. They chase off John McCausland's men, and then they start putting the town under martial guard. Now, Judge Watts makes a very chivalrous gesture. He tells the people of Chambersburg that anybody that wants to leave town and go somewhere else to stay with family or whatever, we will give you a free one-way train ride out of Chambersburg for you and your families, whatever possessions you may have salvaged, and we'll take you to Harrisburg. From there, you're on your own to decide where you're going to go. And by the way, if you ever want to come back to Chambersburg, you're going to have to buy a train ticket to come back. But again, the Cumberland Valley starts getting some nice publicity and press for transporting these refugees in and out. And oh, by the way, 201st Pennsylvania, they're emblematic. Every single United States soldier that rides on the Cumberland Valley Railroad rides for about $5 a head. Why is that significant? Because if you or I were civilians in those days and we wanted to buy a ticket from Hagerstown to Chambersburg, it's less than $2. Put a blue suit on, and we got to pay $5. So the Cumberland Valley, like most of the three major railroads that ran between Maryland and Pennsylvania, is making a killing off the war effort. Absolute killing. Doing very, very well financially as they're doing that. In fact, they got so much money rolling in, they're going to buy two of the most powerful locomotives on earth for freight hauls in 1865, but the war is going to end before they can do that. Cumberland Valley is going to make headlines one last time during the war when Judge Watts opens the trains up for free for any mourners that want to come to Harrisburg to go view the body of Abraham Lincoln lying in state at the Capitol building in downtown Harrisburg. That's a nice gesture. The problem is that there's a massive thunderstorm going on. Tens of thousands of people crowd into downtown Harrisburg. Most of them can't ever get into the building to see the body of Lincoln because the lines are so slow. And the train finally pulls out with Lincoln's body to go to Philadelphia the next morning, leaving most of the people standing in line bitter they never got to see it. And oh, by the way, the Cumberland Valley charges them for the trip back down to Chambersburg. So all these soggy, wet, disgruntled people are now heading back to Chambersburg, having not seen Abraham Lincoln's body. Over the next 4 weeks to 5 weeks, the Cumberland Valley again starts making significant cash as they start bringing most of the troops back out of the Shenandoah Valley. They're going to march up to Hagerstown, being put on the Cumberland Valley, and almost all of the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley that leave via rail are going to leave on the CVRR, head back to Harrisburg, again, at roughly $5 a head. So, final slide. The railroad, with this massive amount of cash it's made during the war, basically rebuilds itself. They're going to build all these wonderful buildings. This wonderful train station in Mechanicsburg is now a railroad museum, fascinating little museum. That's the oldest remaining structure on the Cumberland Valley Railroad, built again right after the war in 1866. Over the next 7 years, they totally rebuilt. One of the other innovations this railroad does is they start building amusement parks. And they run spurs into places like Williams Grove, now to this day a sprint car track. But Williams Grove was a major amusement park for many years during the 1880s, 1890s. Finally, in 1919, the Pennsylvania Railroad is acquires the Cumberland Valley and puts the Cumberland Valley officially out of business as an independent company. Today, much of the tracks of the original right-of-way of the Cumberland Valley is still used by the Norfolk and Southern, except they go around all the towns. They don't run through downtown anymore. So hopefully you've now taken a quick look at this little railroad. I call it the little railroad that could, because most people have never heard of this, but the Cumberland Valley played a huge role. It is the only railroad in the north of the Mason-Dixon line, to be raided by the Confederate Army 3 straight years. Baltimore and Ohio, of course, gets raided more often, but the B&O is south of the Mason-Dixon line. So the Cumberland Valley will get down in the record books as the #1 northern target as far as a railroad goes for the entire Confederate Army during the Civil War. So on behalf of my publisher, Savitz Beatty, my co-author, Cooper Wingert, and most of all, thank you to Civil War Talk, Laura, Mike, Lisa, Tina, all the folks that are involved. With that, thanks so much for your time today, and we'll now open the floor up to any questions. And of course, as you can see, coming in June 21st, Unceasing Fury, Texans of Chickamauga. We'll talk just a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. All right, I will turn this back over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mingus. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions in the chat log that we're going to get to in just a moment. In the meantime, if you have questions that you thought of, but you haven't yet entered those in the chat box, go ahead and do that now. And we are going to introduce Mike Kendra, the owner of Civil War Talk. And Mike is going to tell us about the American Civil War Discussion Forum, CivilWarTalk.com. Mike?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Mr. Mingus. That was a great discussion and great topic. I like talking about Civil War railroads, so that was a great discussion to have. And I jumped in the middle of it, but it was a lot of fun to follow along and hear about a lot of the places I've visited over the years, and I'm sure everybody else enjoyed it as well. But I wanted to talk to everybody today, though, about Civil War Talk. That's our Civil War forum. It's a community that we have that we'd like to invite everybody to visit. We have places where if you have a great Civil War book, or if you're a battlefield guide or a researcher, maybe a collector, and you have a story to tell, we'd love to speak with you about providing a presentation like the one we're having tonight. So if you're an author, but you're concerned about a Zoom presentation, maybe if it's more than you think you can handle, but perhaps you consider a book launch at CivilWarTalk.com. We can also partner with you to execute a social media campaign to go along with Civil War Talk Zoom presentations, or you can schedule a book launch today. We love our weekly Civil War Talk Presents programs, but there's much more to Civil War Talk that you want to experience in a Zoom meeting. We have our share of everyday visitors who share stories and do research, but we also have a large community of historians, reenactors, and students. We would even say fanatics of the American Civil War. Many of us don't just read a story or two about the Civil War. We live, love, and love to learn about the era. It's our passion. Civil War Talk had its origins way back in 1999, and today we've grown into a modern community with over 24,000 members and over 116,000 different discussions about the war between the states. Membership in our community's always been free, and it's really easy to join too. So I want to invite you all to join our community today. If you haven't already, you'll find stories that you'll cherish, you'll find knowledge that'll thrill, challenge, and enlighten you, and you'll find friends that'll last a lifetime. Join Civil War Talk tonight, and we hope to see you all there in our community soon.
Great, thanks, Mike. Here's the homepage, what it looks like today, and I hope that everyone will join the community tonight and become a member. Mr. Mingus, if you are ready, we will get to those questions, and I will read those for you from the chat log and get the answers. If you have a question that you thought of but you haven't entered it yet, it's not too late. You can go ahead and do that now, and we will answer your questions as they appear in the chat log. Let's see. Let me find the first question for you. Let's see. The first question was about the guardrails. You talked about one of the bridges that didn't have any guardrails, and then you said they started using mules. And did they add those guardrails when they started to use the mules?
No, actually, they didn't use. No, they throughout much of their history, they never really put guardrails up there. The assumption was the train's going to stay on the tracks, and as long as we're driving carefully and not recklessly, we're not going into the water. And in the entire history of the railroad, they were right. Not a single train ever did drop into the railroad, although in the early days there were plenty of people worried about that. But yeah, they didn't do it. It's one of the things that being a small railroad, always worried about pinching pennies. That was an unnecessary expense.
Because I guess as long as the train stayed on the tracks, it wasn't going to go off the.
That was the key.
So Paul would like to know, there was a slide that you showed that had the background was a picture, and he was asking was that background from the Appalachian Trail on South Mountain. And I believe it was a slide that you showed that was just before the ride around McClellan, maybe.
Yeah, he's right. Yeah, that was taken for the Appalachian Trail. I can't remember the name of the photographer. I had it listed on the credits underneath the picture, but yeah, it was a photo that I had got permission to use for this slide presentation. Most of the backgrounds were a postcard from my postcard collection that showed the Cumberland Valley in the early 1910s, which would have been similar to the view the Confederates would have had. Today, if you take pictures of the Cumberland Valley, you're going to see an awful lot of modern buildings.
Well, Paul must have recognized that it is the Appalachian Trail because he asked. And the next one's not a question, but I said, thank you, Mr. Bob Patterson, for the Egyptian cotton sheets.
There we go.
So he was the first man to import Egyptian cotton. That's what you said?
In any large quantity in the North. He was the one that pretty much popularized it. There were other people that were using Egyptian cotton in small degrees, but it was Patterson who really pretty much took full bore in importing cotton for his garment factories and his other business interests in the Philadelphia area.
Okay. Paul would like to know the September 1862 accident that you talked about where the train ran into the little engine. were these types of accidents normal for the railroads in the desperation to move troops in pursuit of Lee, or is this the only one you know of during this time?
That's a great question. It's actually the only significant accident the Cumberland Valley Railroad actually has in its entire history during the Civil War. Now, other railroads are plagued with them. I wrote a book called Soldiers, Spies, and Steam, History of the Northern Central Railway in the Civil War. The NCR, which again ran from Baltimore to Harrisburg, connected with the Cumberland Valley Railroad. That railroad was plagued with all kinds of disasters. In fact, in early September 1861, three guys are killed and 5 are significantly wounded when a train runs off the tracks in Baltimore County, Maryland. So most of the other roads have that problem. Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore had problems. Pennsylvania Railroad had some crashes. In fact, there was a horrible crash that killed, can't remember exact number, but Jake Wynn has documented that on his excellent blog, Winning History, WYNNING. But Jake talks a lot about that as well. So this was not uncommon for most railroads by any stretch of imagination, but it was for the CVRR. That was unique to them.
Okay. Nancy asked, before the CVRR founders decided to build the northern route that goes through Newville, had they considered building along another route that Thaddeus Stevens had proposed for the Tapeworm Railroad through western Adams County?
Yeah, the Tapeworm Railroad was originally envisioned to connect the Northern Central, in fact, to Chambersburg, and it was going to connect in Gettysburg. So Thaddeus Stevens had the idea of running this railroad, up and over, if you will, South Mountain. Now, never got built, but it was certainly something that was his. I hate to use the term pipe dream, but he really wanted to get it built, and it was to try to, if you will, cut off the base of the horseshoe. Because you remember one slide I showed on the route from Baltimore in yellow. He went north from Baltimore up through York to Harrisburg, and then back down through Carlisle. And all the way over. And in the middle of that is Gettysburg. Now, at the time of the Gettysburg campaign, there is a railroad that ran from Hanover Junction on the northern central and southern York County through Hanover, New Oxford, and into Gettysburg. And that railroad was unfinished, as we all know. The railroad cuts were west of town, and that was designed in the spirit of the old tapeworm, although it wasn't certainly the tapeworm per se. But yeah, that dream that Stevens had originally of trying to connect Chambersburg to York through Gettysburg was certainly something that would later finally be accomplished in the years after the Civil War.
Okay. And the last question that we're going to have time for tonight, but we're going to post the chat transcript in the thread on Civil War Talk, and would invite people to, if you think of additional questions, to post them there. And Scott, would you address some of those questions there in the thread?
Absolutely.
Okay, here's the last question. Did Averill have a division of cavalry, or about how many men?
Oh, yeah.
That he could have taken to the relief of
That's one I answer on the website. He had a few thousand men, but I honestly, off the top of my head, can't remember exactly. I've got it in the book, so I'll look that up and simply write the response on the Civil War Talk thread.
That'll be great. That was actually my question. And I just wondered, was it brigades or did he have a whole division?
He had a small division, if I remember, but it was more troops than McCausland had.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for answering all the questions and for agreeing to also address the questions there in the forum. We really appreciate you coming and being here tonight and providing the presentation. Just a reminder that everyone, we encourage all of our presenters, they do these talks without any compensation. And so we encourage everyone to order your own copy of Mr. Mingus's book, Targeted Tracks, the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And our friends at Savas Beatty want to thank everyone for attending tonight and participating in the event. When you order Mr. Mingus's book through the Savas Beatty website, add the code at checkout to receive 20% off of your total purchase. You can just load the books in your cart and then enter the code that Tina's going to enter that code in the chat log, and you can enter that code when you check out, and you'll get 20% off of your entire purchase. Here's a couple of other books that Mr. Mingus has available at Savas Beatty. You can order all of them, all three, and get 20% off of the entire order. And the 20% discount applies to these other two books that Savas Beatty have in stock, and including Confederate General Extra Billy Smith that Tina mentioned earlier, From Virginia's State House to Gettysburg's Scapegoat, which is the winner of the James I. Robertson Junior Literary Award for Confederate History and other prestigious awards. Be sure to visit Scott's Amazon authors page, where you can view all of the great Civil War and Underground Railroad titles that he has authored and co-authored, and you can purchase those there. Coming in June of 2021, we're going to have Scott back before June of 2021, because I know that everyone who's a member of Civil War Talk will be interested in this new book that Scott has coming out in June, Unceasing Fury, Texans at the Battle of Chickamauga, September 18th to 20th, 1863. And I can't wait for that one to come out. Upcoming on Civil War Talk Presents next week, we have Mr. Ronald Kirkwood, and he will be here to talk about the George Spangler Farm Hospitals and the Battle of Gettysburg. November 18th, Ken Rutherford on landmines in the Civil War. December 2nd, Steve Norder, Lincoln Takes Command. December 9th, Christopher Loperfido on the Civil War letters of Surgeon James D. Benton of the 111th and 98th New York. On December 16th, Bradley Gottfried with the maps of the cavalry in the Gettysburg campaign. December 30th, John Corstein will be back with us again, and he will be doing a almost anniversary program on the sinking of the USS Monitor, almost on the date of its sinking. And January 9th, Lance Hertigan will be back to talk more about the Iron Brigade, and just confirmed today on January, whatever the next Wednesday is, that's not the 9th. If somebody has a calendar, I believe it's the 13th, 18th, I don't know. We just confirmed it today. We'll have Matt Atkinson from the Gettysburg National Military Park here that day. And his topic is to be determined, but he is confirmed for that date. If somebody can look at their calendar and tell us what that date is, that'd be great.
16th maybe? 16th probably.
Yeah, January 16th. So we'll have Matt Atkinson on that date, and we're looking forward to that. Our next Civil War Talk Presents will be next Wednesday, November 11th at 8:30 Eastern. And we will be featuring Ronald D. Kirkwood and on his book, Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals and the Battle of Gettysburg. I hope you'll all join us then, and Savas Beatty will have a discount code for you for that book also. I hope you'll be tuning in on that night. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and we will see you next Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thanks again.